So without any further ado, we're looking at the summer lecture series of 2019. I always given the 3 weeks, the 3 weeks lecture series. The title of the series is The Russian Pogroms of 1881, Harbinger of Extermination, or Blessing in Disguise. Tonight is the second of 6 lectures, which I entitled The Jewish Kulturkampf, the Radical Haskalah, and the Emergence of Jewish Orthodoxy, which is a part of what we're going to be speaking. Now I'll get down to substance. We're talking about the middle of the 1800s. The pogroms take place in 1881. So it's at the very end of the most interesting of the Tsarist reigns, and that's Alexander II we're about to start. And it's after his assassination all these anti-Jewish things break out. And he came after Nicholas I, who we spoke of last time, the big mamzer, who was there for 30 years. And it's his son. It's Nicholas I, followed by Alexander II. And the son realized, that change is necessary in Russia, because the defeat in the Crimean War exposed the hollowness of the system, and the whole thing could come crashing down. The problem, now comes the very interesting part. The problem with change. Obama ran on change. Remember? The problem with change, especially big change, is the unintended consequences that appear. That's the iron law of history. You introduce changes, and some of the things you expect to happen will happen if plans go right, but they're the unintended things that happen, and sometimes you get a bigger proportion than the things you expected to happen. And the reign of Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, from 1855 to 1881, 26 years, is the poster boy for what I just said. Because he was, and I was going to show you a sign, overwhelmed by the unexpected consequences of large-scale changes. These Tsars didn't have a college education. He was better educated than the others, actually. What does it take to... I'm asking a good question. What is the proper education to be a ruler, especially an absolute ruler of an empire? Plato wrote a book about it. Maybe you heard about it, called Republic, in which there's a long course of education. First you got to do this. You have a little bit of experience in administration, a little bit of experience in the military, a little bit of experience in finance, a little bit of experience in agriculture, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's good for a book. But what happens? The answer is not that much. They go through a couple of motions, but then you're handed these huge areas. And it's not like you have the biggest IQ that ever walked down the road. No, I'm saying this is the problem with hereditary government or monarchy of any kind. Every once in a while you get a Peter the Great with a big brain, and then the next person comes. You see? So Alexander II, who introduces changes and some changes, comes to be overwhelmed by the unintended consequences of those. And by the way, we will see that the Jews are also overwhelmed by these unintended consequences. It's one of the main points I want to make in this series. Now, to be fair, his father, Nicholas I, had left his son in an impossible situation. 3 decades of consistent and extreme repression, and Nicholas loved repression. Yeah, he actually, got kicks out of that. Had created a seething volcano whose explosion had been held down by main force. So there's a lot of people who didn't like the way Russia was run. You had these liberals who wanted a constitution. You had the serfs who were not happy with the slavery. You have the Jews obviously who don't like the way they're being treated. The Poles obviously don't like the way they're being treated. Or the artists and the others don't have a freedom of expression except within narrow limits, and so on and so on and so forth. And so, but you can't do anything because he was like Stalin. Now he wasn't like Stalin, but by the 19th century terms, he really held everything down with a secret police and all the rest of it, by the standards of that era. And if you kept open your mouth, you go to Siberia. Now, so he could do it. But the minute it's released, the minute you take your hand off, boom. Right? The volcano is explosion, especially in Russia, in the form of terrorism. Because the terrorism starts in our world. The terrorism that you and I talk about has its origins in Tsarist Russia in the reign of Alexander II, including all the theoreticians of terrorism and the nihilism. You understand, terrorism is a logical tool. The person who doesn't have an army, all the rest of it. One way of bringing about a change is through terrorism. Now, I don't like it, and you don't like it, but I'm talking for the person that has a goal. If you don't have a big army, all the rest of it, through certain tactics, through assassinations, through terror, through introducing fear and all that, a few people can make a big change. And this is true. Okay? What started World War I with the 60, 70 million deaths? The terrorists shot the Archduke. It worked. Why did the terrorists shoot the Archduke? They wanted Bosnia to become part of Yugoslavia. It worked. You understand what I'm saying? So, it's crazy the way these things develop. Now, I was going to try, and I'll try to do it later. We experienced this very recently in Russia with Gorbachev. It's the same thing. Many knowledgeable journalists and that sort of thing, when Gorbachev, remember him? When Gorbachev was in power, everybody said, all of a sudden a lot of books came out on Alexander II in the library. And it was a couple of good ones too. And the reason is because each one tried to have moderate change, and you kind of can't. You moderately liberalize an extremely repressive system, and it's Gatenished. Because what you really want to say like this, I give you a little bit of freedom so you can use an extra 10 words. No, I want to use 100 words. No, don't do that. You see? I give you a little more wage increase. No, I want a lot more wage. You know, how do you stay in control? And this is what happened with Gorbachev, because it got out of control and the communism fell down. And it happened in a different way in the time of Alexander II. Not the same way, but it got out of control. And in the end, even though he was the most liberal of all these czars, and if you want to call that liberal, they took him down. They killed him by the terrorism after many attempts. So it's just interesting that the terrorism didn't rise under Nicholas I, who was, super. But there's no terror in Russia under Stalin. No, I'm serious. Get it? Because the terrorist is in charge. No, really. You get what I'm saying? If the mafia is in charge, nobody's messing with the mafia. It's like that. That's what happened. So that's how it was like mutatis mutandis with Nikolai I, but then his son came along. Now, bureaucratic institutions like the courts and the army can be reformed relatively easily. I told you at the end of the last lecture that in the time of Alexander II, and pretty soon you'll see how this impacts on the Jews. He undertook and he said, things are rotten in the state of Russia, and some things have to be changed. The court system was a joke beyond jokes, and they completely overhauled it. And they actually gave Russia a fair court system, which is kind of interesting. Now, you didn't have a fair court system under the communists, but you did have a fair court system in the last year of the Tsar. You may perhaps remember the Bayless case, where in 1912, 1913, the state prosecuted this Jewish guy for the blood libel. I want to understand what I'm saying. The Attorney General brought charges. This was an official indictment by the government that this guy Bayless killed a girl to use the blood, and it was a jury trial, and it's very famous at the end. And he had a good lawyer, a famous Jewish lawyer, Grusenberg. And at the end, the jury said like this, and it was a jury of peasants, Ukrainian peasants. And they said, we know he did it, but we have to give a verdict of not guilty because there was no evidence. So that's a high madrega of justice system. You understand? So you think, Tsarist Russia, all the rest of it. Maybe before Alexander, after Alexander, Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II, you actually had courts. So that's important. They overhauled the army, if that means anything to you. And institutions like that are sort of hierarchical, and you can do that. You can build railroads. He multiplied the railroads from 1,000 miles to 13,000 miles. Still wasn't enough. Even today, Russia doesn't have roads and railroads. I assure you. You go to most of these little towns in Russia, it's no roads. You get it? They go to Uman, don't they? So I saw in the New York Times, Lubavitch, I guess, why should I go to Uman? Go to Lubavitch, that should be a pilgrimage site. So they went to the town of Lubavitch, which is somewhere in Belarus now, and they're interviewing the mayor, and this is poor, baby. And he says, sure, anything to bring in to bring in the tourism. Whoops. Wait a minute. But they had a photograph of the mayor. It's the summer. He's just in shorts. This is the mayor. He doesn't have any clothes, right? We have no idea of what we're dealing with here is the fact they never did put the necessary amount of resources into infrastructure, which is just interesting. It's a certain mentality. So railroads can be built easily, but what about freedom of the press? Alexander II wants to have a little bit of freedom of press so that some people can express some ideas, but the whole idea goes like this. You can criticize a little bit. Don't criticize a lot. But what's considered a lot? When you criticize me, it's a lot. When you criticize you, it's a little bit. You see? And naturally, the press immediately says, I guess, no, we want more and more and more. And it kind of got out of hand. And without boring you with all the details, they have one commission after another to try to figure out how to do that. Freedom to travel. Under Nikolai, it was like under the communists. You couldn't leave Russia. Under Alexander, you have freedom to travel. But they take advantage of it. He said, no, I don't want you to travel to Western countries and pick up bad ideas and come back with a bad idea. Well, what's going to happen, freedom to read. Under Nikolai I, you couldn't bring any books into Russia. No foreign, very little foreign material got in across the border. Now it's much more liberal. Guess what? People read these books and they say, an idea. And what Alexander meant was like this. You can read the book, but don't take it seriously and apply it. Right? Yeah. So you see what I'm saying? You're trying to hold down Quicksilver, So what if this leads to radical change, a call to radical change? The Tsar was not ready for that. Most significantly, of course, as far as the Geisha stuff is concerned, was the emancipation of the slaves or the serfs. Now, this is incredibly complicated. People don't realize, look at this. Hooray. Hooray. That's okay. Thank you. They're professionals. No, I'm serious. The emancipation of the serfs. You can't just tell 20 million people, okay, you're free. Goodbye. What's the plan? These are peasants. Who gets the land? How do you divide up the land? Who gets to eat? Who works for who? Do you do the following, for example? Listen close, I'm going to say. Okay, there's 20 million peasants. I'll give each one 10 miles. So that's, 200 million miles. And now you're on your own. What will happen in a year? What will happen in a year? What will happen in a year? 5% will own the rest. Right? Have you heard of Parshas Yisro? What do I mean? The Jews just left Egypt. Yisro shows up. Moshe's judging cases from morning to evening. He said, you can't, what cases? They just left Egypt. Everybody was under double guilt. What cases? You give everybody $1 million in a week. 2 guys have the money. So it goes. The Torah knows that. That's why they have Yovel. Every 50 years they have a reset button. Otherwise, smart, unscrupulous people, of which we have none in Baltimore, he says, will own up all the land. Okay? To buy up all the houses, as they say. So here you are in Russia, you let 25 million people all of a sudden, what's the plan? So it was incredibly complicated. Until then, until 1861, the 25 million people didn't count. Literally, the nobles had organized life and held millions in tow. How did serfdom arise and get popular? Kings liked it because that way the nobles control the huge population. And it's changed for living a high lifestyle. They'll give me the soldiers whenever I need. They'll give me the taxes whenever I need and all that sort of thing. The masses had no say in anything. This is going to be very important when the pogroms pop up. Because until Alexander II, you couldn't have these mass pogrom situations. There aren't masses. They're living in the countryside and they have no say in anything. They're as enslaved as the blacks were in the South. People don't know it. People don't know it because they think they're white and white. So it was the same thing. Now, as far as the Jews are concerned, until the emancipation of 1861, the masses had nothing to say about the Jews. I mean, they had nothing to say at all, period. But now the serfs are emancipated. If they're going to have full rights, whatever full rights were in Russia, then they're going to be released like a flood on the body politic and on the labor markets. And you tell me what the consequences are. Because all of a sudden, you have 25 million people that the countryside doesn't have enough room for them, and they're rushing to the cities and they want jobs. And when they come to the cities, what are they going to see? Right? Now, the slaves were not totally emancipated, Reality is more complicated than that. Just look what happened in the USA. The slaves were freed, the black slaves. They were given no land, and so they all ended up sharecroppers. So it's back to slavery. Isn't that the history of America? The Reconstruction? What happened to the South? They went from one kind of slavery to a different slavery. It wasn't the same, right? They didn't own you like they owned before the Civil War and could buy and sell families as an upgrade, but substantially, it was a wage slavery, throughout the South. We know this. Wasn't this the machlokas? There's what I was telling you before, that the father had let the son have a bad Yerusha because he closed up the system too much. And let's see the next one, if we can. Okay. I'm tossing back and forth in tandem here. But if you know anything at all about American history, when you see some of these movies, it was a machlokas between Abraham Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens. Is that correct? And a little bit of what did Thaddeus Stevens say? Radical Republican. Destroy the white owners, kill them or kick them out, and give the slaves their land. And that way you'll really crush the rebellion and make sure there's no more confederacy. Yeah, this is the parallel, as I told you, between Alexander II and Gorbachev. And we got the other one here. And that's what, there's Thaddeus Stevens on the left, and there's Abraham Lincoln in the middle. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, was killed. And Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson did not give the blacks land. And so the result is, he was impeached. But that didn't mean anything because he beat it. As I think everybody knows, impeached just means by the House, but the Senate didn't vote for it. And this has nothing to do with Trump whatsoever. Anyway, you had a mess in terms of, we still do, in terms of the, what shall I say, not well thought out emancipation process back in 1860s. So take that and put it in Russian terms, okay? Now in Russia, a very complicated system was set up whereby the freed serfs could plow land owned by the village but not by themselves. So they said the village owns the land, but you know what that means. As soon as the village owns the land, the president of the shul gives it to his son-in-law, to his brother-in-law, to this, that, and the other. It's the old nepotism, okay? And therefore the village elders have non-efficiency aspects in the countryside, and Russian agriculture became a mess. So the emancipation was rather botched, and a large population of peasants who wanted their own land appeared, creating new social problem of the first magnitude, and the huge masses of people in the countryside who wanted land but couldn't get land is a major reason for the Russian Revolution. And what's the first thing that Lenin said when he takes power in 1917? Bread, land, and peace. Land. Now, it's a lie. The communists will take all the land away, put them in kolkhoz, what do you call it, the collective form, but they didn't know it. He said everybody will get land. So, by the way, had they gone the genuinely capitalist route, like I told you before, it would have weeded out the losers from the kulaks, from the successful farmers, and then you would have had a different system in which you have a smaller number of peasants in the countryside, but they run the agriculture more efficiently. That's what they tried to do later on under Stolypin, called a wager on the strong. I mean, just let it go, let the strong farmers, take over, and then Russia started to grow more food. Why am I mentioning all this? What does it have to do with Jews? Well, the end of serfdom means millions moved to the towns and the cities. See, here we are in the 1860s and 1870s, and the pogroms are 1881. There aren't enough jobs to go around. In a free economy, you might have had dramatic growth, which would have dramatically increased the number of jobs, as Donald Trump keeps telling us. That's the next one. Right. Well, it's about jobs. And Russia certainly had the resources, and they could have gone the capitalist route and just step aside and let the free market take its own way, but then they'd have to let the Jews and everybody else participate without all kind of stupid rules along the way, and they just exist with stupid rules. So suddenly in the 1860s and 70s, the Russian urban centers, especially the newer ones, fill up with former serfs looking for work, and they're looking for work desperately. Many do not find work, which makes them sullen. And they don't blame the government, not yet anyway, that comes later, that's called a revolution. But when they come to the towns, what do they see? They do see Jewish-owned stores and businesses all over the place. They do encounter poor Jews, poor as themselves, who are also seeking employment. So what does that mean? There's a competition. They do encounter Jews as competing for the same jobs and the same business opportunities. They don't run into Tsar Alexander, but they do run into the uncle and schmunkle. And so who are they going to be angry at? I could have had that job, but the damn Jew took it from me. Or better yet, the Jewish guy, this happened very often. The Jewish guy is a capitalist. He built a factory, and he's only hiring his own. Or he's hiring too many of his own. There were many Jewish factory owners that wouldn't hire Jews because they're afraid what the workers and everybody would say. This was always a big scandal. I'm just trying to show you how complicated a mess emancipation can be. So I think you see where I'm starting to go with this in terms of the outbreaks that will occur in 1881 and 1882. Hold that thought, everything I just said. And now let's switch to how did the Tsar Alexander II relate to the Jews, the Yidden? Were they going to be part of his reforms? Well, it goes like this. The first thing you have to understand is that he was a mamzer too. He hated the Jews as much as his father, but he wasn't so ruthless. He was ruthless, just not as ruthless as Nikolai. Nobody was. Okay? So like father, like son, but not as much. It was a little more civilized. So let's start with that. But still, he has the same fear as his father that if you release the Jews and give them emancipation, they'll own the country in a year. Right? They'll buy up all the land, they'll Ulster to control everything, and they'll put me out of a job. They'll buy a palace. So any changes and any improvements that will occur during his 26-year reign, and he's the best of the czars as far as the Jews are concerned. I'm telling you now, the best. The others are much worse. Okay? So the best stinks. Those are worse. Welcome to Tsarist Russia. Any changes, any improvements that will occur during his 26-year reign will be like pulling teeth. He doesn't want to do it. There are endless commissions. When he feels he has no choice, they'll give in, but then he always says in the end, but we'll attach rioters and qualifications and this and that. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details. There are books on this, believe it or not. They're actually read by people. But it's unbelievable bureaucracy. But nevertheless, you always see the Tsar writing on margin over here. He said, this is going too far, or putting qualifications, or I side with the ones who say don't do this, and all the rest of it. He's always, built that way. So there are changes, but I won't say too little too late, but they're too little too late. For example, they did abolish the cantonist system of kidnapping the boys. That's huge. No question about it. It took a year, but he did it. But on the other hand, they wouldn't let the kids go back to their families, the one who had converted. So if you had these kids or teenagers, whatever, who had under pressure converted, but now they're free, so they want to go back. No, you can't go back. So that's a total example of the type of regime that you're talking about over here. They can't do the right thing. Eventually, as part of the great military reforms, he had a Miliutin. By the way, this is a very good book. It's let's go back one. Let's go back one. This is a classic Maskilic book of 100 years ago. By Yami Mahain. And it's like the Mark Twain of the Cantonists. So if you want to, if you want to be a little bit educated, make it your business to get a hold. It might be online for all I know. There's an old Moscow guy, Hebrew teacher in the Ukraine who wrote a book about life as a Nikolai soldier and all that sort of thing. And that I'm just telling you, to add to your education. That's the book on the subject from that era in terms of novels. Now let's go to the next one. And here's the guy who reformed the army. So they got rid of the cantonist soldier, and they introduced like regular in the West, a regular draft conscription for the whole public. The Jews too, like everybody else, but not this business like Nikolai had that if the Jewish community doesn't supply 3 people, then their heads will be shot or something like that. Now, still, it's not fun to be in the Russian army, but millions of Jews will end up in the Russian army in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, down all the way to the end. Plenty of Jews will serve in the Russian army. They won't be treated so well, but on the other hand, they won't be beat up. He got rid of that stuff. You understand? He got rid of the old, what's the right word? Barbaric system. He actually introduced Western business. It used to be, it's a mitzvah to hit a soldier over the head with a stick. And then after 1872 or whatever it was, no, it's like the West. You can't hit a soldier. You ever hear of General Patton? What did Eisenhower do when he slapped a soldier? Fired, remember? So I'm just trying to show you, there are differences in the new regime. What happens over here? Some Jews start to say, well, it's a new Russia, it's a new day. Maybe we can join. The French Jews are becoming French, the German Jews are becoming German, the British Jews are becoming British patriots, the American Jews want to Americanize. So in Russia, and little by little, it takes a while, it's longer than it should be, but little by little, we're getting there. And so Russification, as they call Russified Jews, or those who seem liable to Russification, are treated with favor by Alexander II because he wants to do anything to weaken the Jewish polity, and consequently anybody who has a university degree or something like that, or is a professional or can speak Russian, you will give the unbelievable privilege of allowing you to move into Russia proper. And I said, this is the best years of the 19th century. So a few Jews, those who look like assimilated and that sort of thing, or if they're big businessmen, you can move to Moscow, to Petersburg, to Kharkov or Katerinburg, all these things, the Ural Mountains, and this kind of business. And only in Russia is this. You have to understand. Only in Russia is permission for somebody in the country to move to another place in the country considered a big chesed. But for the Jews it was. There's always a million reservations and qualifications. So some Jews, a few Jews, do move into Russia proper during the reign of Alexander II. But for the poor masses of Jews, well, it is a paradise after Nicholas I. Anything is. Listen, there are Soviet Jews who will tell you they lived in the 50s after Stalin died. Life was tough, but, compared to that, it's Gan Eden. You see? So it's always relative. On the other hand, Alexander and his officials were determined the expression was, bring the Jews closer to the Russians, to raise their madrega, because the Jews are low, immoral, cheaters, bad civilization, all the rest of it. The Russians are Gavaldic, they're models of sobriety, as we all know. Anyway, so we want to bring the Jews closer to the Russians by systematically going after cultural insularity, just like his father did. So Alexander II, for example, declared that after 20 years, all rabbis would be replaced by crown rabbis. Those all rabbanim would be replaced by government-appointed trained rabbis. And all cheters would be eliminated and replaced by, chizuk emunah, about the fellow, something like that. And then the next stage would be they're replaced by public school. That was the plan. Which was a sort of Damocles holding over the heads of all the rabbis and rabbis, I guess, teachers, for 20 years. In the end, it was so hard to push that through, and there was so much bribery and things that went on that it didn't come to pass. But you see what the goal was. Already in the time of Nikolai, these anti-Judaism policies and actions had led, very interestingly, among Russian Jewry, to the beginning of what I would call a Haredi consciousness. The beginning of it in Eastern Europe, meaning you have a self-conscious identity against the government policies and against the maskilic policies, the policy of the Haskalah, on the part of a tiny few. Very briefly, that's one of the things I want to talk about tonight. There's such a thing, and we have it in Baltimore also, there's such a thing as a person being observant, but that's it. And there's other people being, no, they feel militantly part of a firm community, and they vote for this candidate, and they have strong ideological opinions, and they follow Gedolim, and all, as opposed to the other guy, I don't know anybody, I don't even know what those words mean. We keep Shabbos because my family always kept Shabbos, more or less. We keep kosher because my mother went to the kosher, but I went to the kosher. It's what you call traditionalism, which is not self-conscious. Get it? Versus the historians use the word orthodoxy to explain what I'm talking about. Nowadays, it's easier to use words Haredism, even though that's not the right term because that sounds like you're in Bnei Brak in Israel. But this notion of a self-consciousness and being a separate part and being militantly in opposition to others that are going on, other trends in Judaism and in life out there that are going on there. This is something that's with us today, but when does it start? So in Germany, it starts with the rise of the Reform movement and the reaction to it. There was no Reform movement in Russia, so when does it arise? Rise in reaction to the efforts of the Tsar to change Judaism. So it's not Reform Judaism, but has de facto that kind of thing. They want to get rid of yeshivas. They want to change the shuls. They want to change the religion. They want people to stop keeping this. They want them to do that. And you find people like Yisrael Salanter and others that say, life just doesn't go on the way it did until now. Where somebody lives in a village, doesn't know what's going on anywhere else. And, life will go on like that forever, like the good earth, No. We have to have lobbies in St. Petersburg. We have to stay in contact with one another. We have to send letters back and forth. We have to know what the government's planning. We have to know what the officials in this place are doing. How are other Jews in this? What are the Hasidim doing? How can we organize a common group of them? This is political activity. And it's a new but it was necessary by what was going on in Russia. In a Tsarist regime, what can you do? It's discreet lobbying, which is bribery. You know what I'm saying? Because that's the only language of it. I know there's no bribery that goes on in the United States, thank God. And Maryland particularly is free of this, okay? But Baltimore's a model. But having said that, this our ancestors lived. What are you supposed to do? What bribery is the tool of the week. It's the tool of the week. What else can you do? So it's a very complex phenomenon I'm talking about over here. The Russian regime, all they know is the Kham, police tactic kind of force. There's no subtlety with them whatsoever, which of course always led to ridiculous results. For example, in 1843 or 44, the Tsar said, Nikolai I said, this is not going fast enough. So he called in the three top Jews. The head of the Misnagdim, the Rebbe Volozhiner, the head of Volozhin Yeshiva, he was the head of all the Litvaks. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, he was the top guy as far as Hasidim were concerned in Russia proper. Tzemach Tzedek. And the head Moskil, a guy named Bezalel Stern, who was the head of the Moskilim in Odessa, in their community. And they came to St. Petersburg, and the government said like this: we want you to put out the word that everybody should become Moskilim and change the religion and change the, what's the right word? The curriculum and we want you to reform Judaism. What are you supposed to do? Yeah, of course they signed whatever he put in front of them, but what does it mean? So, here, let's go to the next one over here. You really, look, that's the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the middle, okay? Tzemach Tzedek of all people. You honestly think he said, we love Moses Mendelssohn down with Rashi and up with Mendelssohn's beer? That's why you had to sign a public decree. Who are you fooling? No, the Russians tell you, no, you got an official thing, he signed it. It's the same mentality like from the Middle Ages, where you'll do anything to get a confession. You can use torture. What's the point of torture? No, but he admitted it. It's a certain, I don't know what, mentality. So this is what the Jews were up to when you deal over here. The major problem for the Jews, at least in my analysis, lies elsewhere, during the reign of Alexander II. Because here we deal with another unintended consequence of Russian politics. And this, my friends, is very, very important, unfortunately, for us today. And we feel with both barrels. Has to do with the press. As I mentioned, Tsar Alexander II eased up a little bit on the freedom of the press. A little bit. And so you start to get a press in Russia in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And a press means lots of newspapers. By the way, today newspapers are being murdered by the internet, correct? But wasn't that many years ago when you had the Baltimore Sun, the Morning Sun and the Evening Sun. Is everybody old enough to remember that? You had two newspapers in the day. And in New York, how many newspapers you had operating at one time? Like a dozen. The Brooklyn Star, 100 years ago. In the golden age. So 1800s, early 1900s, the golden age of newspapers. Many, many newspapers. In Baltimore, you had also, besides the Sun, you also had the News American. So I'm just telling you, this is the thing of old. Well, what do these many newspapers represent? If it's America, they don't represent that much of a difference. A Democrat or Republican, not that far, not the newspapers. If it's Russia, they all represent a whole rainbow, 39 flavors of ideology. This would be the liberals, this would be conservatives, this is extreme conservative, this is the radical liberals, this is the socialists, this, that, and the other. All these newspapers competing at the same time. So you got the New York Times, and they certainly had their newspapers like the New York Times, but you also had a lot of Pat Buchanan. Okay? That's how it goes. You really have in Russia extreme anti-Semitic newspapers and whole literature mass distributed for the first time because you have a press. So the newspaper turned into a cancer. Before that, there weren't any newspapers, and the few newspapers you had on the time of Nikolai I could only write about operas and sports and things like that. No politics whatsoever, zero. That's reserved entirely for the Tsar. Now people can express themselves. So let me tell you something. If you're a right-wing anti-Semitic newspaper, the censors will not bother you at all. In fact, the Tsar will actually like your newspaper. Get it? And so there develops a very vigorous and powerful and strong anti-Semitic press, magazines, newspapers, journals, with all kind of writers in it, and they spread a whole world. This is the beginnings of the protocols the elders designed, which appears 50 years later in Russia. Okay? And it's nothing but a distillation of what you find in the Russian press, starting in the late 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the rest of it. And these ideas will feed Hitler. These ideas are on the internet today. These ideas get tremendous traction. And we all know, as I say each time, just ask around the world, who did 9/11? Who did 9/11? Because it was the Jews, of course. There's a disinformation, okay? But they're into this, okay? Now, what shall I tell you? The mass distribution of anti-Semitism is going to be a major reason for the pogroms in the 1880s and later on as well. It's a major reason that there's a very strong strain of Russian anti-Semitism. It's not the only strain, but there's a very strong one, constantly fed for decades by this anti-Semitic press. It's interesting, under the communists, you didn't exactly have that. You did have anti-Semitism in the press. There are people who can say it better than I do, but not in the exact same way, and not in such heavy doses. As for the liberal press in Russia, they were wimps. They didn't really defend the Jews because they're afraid of being looked at as pawns and stooges of the Jews. So they didn't really step up and fight in Emil Zola type of battles. And so the reactionary press is what we're talking about over here. They know the Tsar likes these papers. He actually reads them. A lot of the top officials read them. But you believe it. You believe it because you want to believe it. Today in America, half the public reads the extreme left-wing press, and half the public reads the extreme right-wing press. And each one's living in their own world, and they're convinced that this is the truth, and the others can't see what's in front of them. So you start to have this in Russia. And the results, therefore, the two major reforms of the Tsar, of the golden age of liberalism, because what I'm talking about is the best years of Russia, Tsarist Russia, turned out to have bad consequences for the Jews. So we're back to the old line of the grandfather. Babe Ruth just hit his biggest home run. Is it good for the Jews? Is it good for the Eden? You see? So, Russia, they just emancipated the serfs. They just gave freedom of the press. They reformed the army. They reformed the courts. Is it good for the Jews? The answer is no. Okay? So there does develop in Russia, in the new atmosphere of freedom, a strong anti-Semitic press. You and I, my friends, are undergoing the same experience today because now we have a new burst of freedom called the Internet, which is unleashed. There's your unintended consequences. It's unleashed all this anti-Semitic garbage. Because when we were young and you didn't have an Internet, you just had a press. And most of the press, mainstream. One thing you don't have in mainstream press, anti-Semitism. Do you get it? One thing you don't have in mainstream press, anti-Semitism. In a place where, to use a better analogy, if there's only Channel 13, Channel 2, and Channel 11, that's all you had, right? Remember? It could be garbage. It could be a vast wasteland. There's no anti-Semitism. But if I don't need to watch TV, I can turn on the Internet, and I can surf the whole world. I can find all kind of anti-Semitic movies and this and that and the other, whatever you want. So there's an unintended consequences of the freedom of information. So is freedom good or not? Is Babe Ruth good for the Jews? This proves to me more of a portentous cancer than you realize, because only in Russia was this kind of anti-Semitic press mainstreamed. What I just described, articles, stories, cartoons, unbelievable vilification, real poison. It's every day. It's all the magazines. You didn't have this in England. You didn't have this in the USA. We had 10,000 newspapers, I bet you, in the 19th century. I don't think any of them did this. Did you have a few nutball anti-Semitic kooks? Yeah. But it's marginalized, Very few people, it's not a regular newspaper. You see? France, Germany, all across Europe. You didn't have this. Russia, you have it. You see? It's a Sonderweg. It's a special cultural situation. So don't be surprised if physical outbreaks like pogroms will break out in Russia and not in other countries. This is huge, what I'm saying. All the tropes will appear in this press and spread elsewhere down till today. And this is an important feature of modern Jewish history, which I believe are not noticed by most historians, because you and I are living with the protocols, Phil Zion, and believed by everybody in one form or another. That's how it goes. You take polls and you're shocked at what you find out. Now, what's really interesting is at this moment in Russia, enjoy it while it lasts. For some reason, under Putin, there's a suspension. There is an anti-Semitic press in Russia, but the government doesn't approve. So under Putin, Russia's taking a vacation for 5 minutes from anti-Semitism. It's very interesting to me. You know, it's what it is. You know, he's got his problems, all the rest of it, but he's not demonizing the Jews. This is a first. Okay, he's got problems. I'm not defending Putin, but his problem is not the Jews. But it's right there under the surface. So as soon as he's gone, or if anybody changed their mind, it's the easiest thing in the world, just turn the switch. All right? Now, the anti-Semitic press will not be met by a vigorous pro-Jewish liberal press. This will play a role in the pogroms, as I said before. Now, in this environment of the new freedom, especially in the 1860s and 70s, you have several famous phenomena, which I'll only tell you one, and that's the terrible phenomenon of the charlatan. Here, next one. Of Brauchman's Knizhny Kal, the Book of the Kahal. What does he say? This guy was a Meshumid, who a Jew converted, and wasn't so successful in the Lutheran Church, and then joined the Russian Orthodox Church, the Protestant Church, and then he hates the Jews. He came from a Jewish background, hates the Jews, and so he sees that he will get traction and he'll get money if he pushes the line for the right-wing anti-Semitic press. And the Jews have a vast conspiracy, a state within a state. They even have in Vilna and in Minsk something called the Kahal. You and I know this as the classic Jewish community of the last 2,000 years. Okay? It's not an anti-Russian conspiracy. The Kahal, look at its own books. These were, by the way, the books of the Kahal were not secret. They were, you could inspect them by the public. And so he takes out and copies out parts of them to show Jews run a state within a state, or at least they had, before they were abolished by Nicholas I. And so they'll enforce religious laws. They'll enforce taxes for shechita. This is Russia. They're running a state within a state. Why? Because it's all a plot. And one day they plan to take over the world. And the Kahal in Russia is going to take over Russia. You understand? You can't understand what enthusiastic reception he got. Because all the anti-Semites said, we knew it. And here's a Jew telling you that. And the Jews said, this is the Kehillah, you know. If you have a tax on shechita, you know, your mother pays the extra 3 cents when they buy a chicken. How's that a plot against Russia or something like that? Oh my goodness. This had such attraction that all the newspapers ran this over. He published in 2 big books. It was a bestseller. It inspired Russian authors to write novels based on this in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and became like a huge theme, and still is today. This book is still being published in Russia. Okay? And like they found, some new vast conspiracy. And the guy you see on the right is not him. The guy you see on the right was a famous Jewish scholar named Avram Eliyahu Harkavi, who was a Jewish guy, ex-yeshiva guy, who went to Germany and got a PhD and came back to Russia and got a job in the library in St. Petersburg, because since he wouldn't convert, they wouldn't give him a job in the university. So the best they could give him was be a specialty librarian in the Oriental Library at St. Petersburg University, and which is a chashuv position. And this guy Brauchman, who's always drunk and so forth, hung around him. He didn't like him, but he's afraid to lose his job to say anything. And it's a very famous story. The university library was across the street from the New York Times of St. Petersburg, the liberal newspaper. I forget what it was called. Fed Musty or something like that. And he came in once and he said, and he was drunk. He said, you got a lot of books in here. He said, yeah, it's a library, He said, who the hell is this guy Ibid? I see him quoted all the time. He read a lot of books. Ibid. So this Harkavi was a smart guy, so he didn't bat an eye. He said, so we have a lot of books for him. Would you like to see some of them? Yeah, he says, well, just fill out a request. Remember the old days in the library, you had to fill out now you do it by your computer. You fill out a request, you give it to the librarian for this book, and you sign your name. So he said, I want all the books written by Ibid. And he just walked across the street at lunchtime and went to the New York Times of St. Petersburg, and they publish us on the front page. This is your expert, your great genius, all the rest of it. But you want to know something? That doesn't mean anything to the public. That doesn't mean anything to the public. The ones who want to believe will believe it. And so, again, what should have been a liberal period at a time of increased opportunity and developing hopes and all the rest of it, turned very poisonous for the Jews, caused a lot of unintended consequences. So this is Russia. Right? You know what feeds into all this? In France, they've started the Protocols of Zion. They founded in 1860, this is the 1860s, an organization called Alliance Israélite Universelle. This is the French version of the American Jewish Committee or something like that, or the Joint. Okay? So, look at the title. The Universal Israelite Alliance. Get it? It's the Protocols of Zion. It's the headquarters of all the Jewish people for a vast international conspiracy. And it's in a foreign country, and they organize the Jews to take over the world. Alliance Israélite Universelle. And they got the French government that they control, because that's why they set up in France. And they're setting up schools to brainwash everybody. And it's a nefarious thing that they like to take over Russia also. Russia defend. This is the international Jewish conspiracy. They're found branches everywhere. Similar organizations, are being created in other Jewish communities in the West. In Britain, they have the Chamber of the Board of Deputies. In America, they'll have, what is eventually the American Jewish Committee and all that junk. And in Germany, they have similar things. In Austria, what do you see over here? The tentacles of a vast, you see what I'm saying? Like that. Vast international conspiracy. Stalin will believe this, because he was born in this era, a little bit later. And when he's head of Russia, especially after the Second World War, when he will hang a whole bunch of Jewish communists in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, what will be the charges? They're working for the Joint Distribution Committee, that vast international Jewish conspiracy that's out to take over Russia. See? It's interesting. So, what do we have over here? A Russian public that is reading and feeding. The Tsar believes this, the government believes, the officials believe, all the rest of it. It's a dangerous Jewish group you got on your hands over here. They look poor and all the rest of it. Really, they're part of a vast campaign, and they're a dangerous element. While all this was happening externally, the Jews of Russia were undergoing great changes internally. As Russian society was moving somewhat to the left culturally, because that's what happens under Alexander II. Once you open up a little bit, people can start to become modern, materialistic, atheistic, scientific-oriented, positivist, socialist. You name it. This is the 19th century. Darwin, maybe you heard of the guy, right? Marx, maybe you heard of the guy. You see what I'm saying? These are gigantic revolutionary intellectual movements, and Russian society is becoming more Western and atheist, so a similar process is going to hit the Jews, particularly the rich and the masculine. 1860s and 70s is even them definitely moving ideologically, mentally to the left. There was a real hope in Russia that civil rights was around the corner. The famous slogan, progress is on the march and nothing can stop it, except in Russia. All right? They didn't know, okay? And they didn't know it at the time. So if you lived in the 1860s and 70s, the Jews believed what many Jews, let's put it this way, believed what they wanted to believe. I mean, all across the board. And many Jews said, it takes a little bit longer, but we're getting to England. We're getting to liberty. It's Russia. Everything takes an extra 10, 20 years. But you'll see, they gave in on this. Nobody ever believed the Tsar would do that. Give it another couple of years. Whatever. Progress is unstoppable and all the rest of it. And therefore, if you believe in that, so many Jews then really wanted to Russify, to be part of the glorious future of a liberal Russia, because that's what they dreamed of. There were some liberal Russian intellectuals, there are some. I'm defining liberal as being fair for all people, including Jews. Tolstoy, for example, people like that. And it would be and by the way, it is a nice dream. We would all like to see a world today in which the whole world, I'm serious, is liberal and tolerant and doesn't spend time on war and tries to get rid of international diseases and hunger and all the rest of it. Why can't everybody be, like this and that and the other? But there's the dream and then there's the reality of it. Okay. Now, what does it mean to Russify? Acculturate, assimilate. Who's the one doing that in the 1860s and 70s? Well, you got your rich, you got your college grads, you got your MDs, you got your lawyers, and a certain type of idealistic intellectual who would end up being a journalist or something like that. The whole class, not a large class, a large class of Jews who really jump in with both feet to become part of the new Russia. As they see it, they'll be Jewish within Russia, but they'll be Jewish the way a German Jew is a German. No, there's very little Judaism, but they'll still, they won't convert. But this is 1% maybe of Russian Jewry. And this 1%, not the 90%, progressively disengages from Jewish culture in the period I'm talking about. You see it's over and over again. Actually, I'm wrong. It's more than 1%. It's actually a small flood of Jewish youth to Russian schools, numbers greatly increasing under Alexander II. This is the main element in the unfirming of Russian Jewry. It takes place in the 1860s and 70s. Because more and more people say this, I want to go to a regular school and not to a cheder or something like that. And so you have the new Trinity. Instead of Gemara Shitosi, you have positivism, evolution, and socialism. This is what the kids are coming home with. And if the parents say, what does this mean? They would say, well, it's not for you. You're from the old. You understand? It's old. There was a famous Russian novel, The War of the I forget how it's called, The War of the Generations. You know, fathers versus sons. You see? So this is, the Jewish version of the father versus sons. So this is what's going on in a very complicated way in Russia. This is more than 1%. This is the future. And these people have a post-Jewish vision. If they're talking about positive socialism and all the other stuff, they're talking about a brave new world in which Judaism plays no role or hardly any role. Now, don't be shocked. We have this in the USA today. They don't interfere with the frum Jews. They're convinced Jewish culture will disappear anyway soon. So why even bother? When they go home, they say, oh, you want to keep Shabbos, keep the Seder, no problem, all the rest of it. And then they go back to where they go. There was another small group. Because they just described a large mass of traditional frum Jews, because of inertia. And they have this group over here to the left. And the Maskilim. They try to position themselves in the middle. Because they want Hebrew, they want Jewish culture, but in a different way. This group tried to occupy the middle ground between the frum on the one hand and the assimilated post-Jewish Jews on the other. They tried. And again, I'm talking about the middle of the 19th century, the reign of Alexander II, immediately preceding the pogroms. This Maskila group had done well under Nikolai I, which made many Jews look on them as traitors, because they did betray the Jewish people. Right? They helped the government go after the cheders, after the yeshivas, try to close down the synagogues, and all kind of stuff like that. When the Tsar said, all Jews have to change their clothes, or we'll cut your ears off, they said, oh, it's a good idea. You understand? That's who they were. The Alexander II years, the 26 years of Alexander II, were the peak years of the Russian Haskalah. Thanks in great part to two literary factors. Two things, and they didn't have internet at that time, but you had the 19th century version of the internet, which is the newspapers. You never had that before. As a mass phenomenon. Think what I just said. In 1700, 1600, 1500, there's no such thing as a million newspapers. When you get to the 1800s, every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the street is reading a newspaper, like we remember from our youth when you went on the subway in New York. Right? Everybody's reading the same newspaper. So first of all, the Maskilim established all these Hebrew newspapers, which is unbelievable. Wow, it's in Hebrew, and all the rest of it. There were Hamagid, Hamel, Tzatfira, this, that, Hazman. There was lots of newspapers. They came out like once a month or something like that. And this is the 19th century. One person in the shtetl is the local Moscow, and he has a little bit of money, so he buys in a newspaper, then it's passed around from person to person. Or maybe he reads it, on Shabbos to all the neighbors that come by. It's the old days, Now, these are the organs of the Haskalah, because they spread their ideas through newspaper articles, which are read. And yet, on the other hand, the Haskalah had always been, at least in principle, nomium, committed to Jewish practice. The ostensible goal of the Haskalah had been to broaden and rationalize Jewish culture and not get rid of it. So it's like an Avi Weiss thing in America today. Understand? We just want to make it wider and not get rid of it. We just want to, modify it. And really very interesting the parallels between the Haskalah on the one and Open Orthodoxy on the other. Very, very similar in many ways. Now, during the 1860s, however, under the impact of what I just described, the new freedom, the moving to the left, the intensification of the positivism, the socialism, and all the other movements in Europe, it's got to hit the Jews sooner or later. And the Haskalah developed a strong left wing which wanted to reform Judaism and Jewish culture. For the first time, they're talking about, in the late 1860s, in newspaper articles, of changing the dinim. Literally like introducing a certain type of reform Judaism. The most famous is what they call Lilienblum affair, when a very famous writer, a young guy named Moshe Leib Lilienblum, published, who had was it from a small town in Lithuania, Žagar, and, had a traditional education, so he knew how to learn. He writes a whole bunch of newspaper called Orthodoxy HaTalmud, which shows how the Gemara is all screwed up and the Jews have to change the laws to fit the modern times better, and here are the reforms that he would suggest. And then he had no Sefos Orthodoxy HaTalmud. And I can't tell you, this was the hot topic in all the shtetls and the towns in White Russia and Lithuania and those places of the 1860s, back and forth. But what does that mean? It means, listen closely, when you push unilaterally to the left, then you get, among other things, a counter push to the right. Okay. One of the curses, or whatever you want to call it, of modern Judaism in the last 200 years is unilateralism. We're just going to do it. I don't care what anybody agrees or not. We're going to do it, and we'll create a new norm, and people will get used to it. That's like Hobby Boys. You know what I'm saying? We're going to do it, and people get used to it. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it makes a big reaction the other way, and the other side never gets over it. Israel did it to the Sephardim when they showed up in Israel in the early 50s, Sal Shabbati. So we'll mess them over to get used to it, and they never got over it. You see? You treat me bad in the 5th grade, it could be that I'll get past it. It's also possible I'll hate you for the rest of your life. Right? And I'll never forget it. Human beings are funny that way. So the traditionalists, to answer these articles, they created an Orthodox newspaper of their own first to respond to the Lilienblum types, called Halavanun. What's the next one? Right. This is the first, just the predecessor of Mishpacha and all that. What does that mean? It's a cultural marker of first magnitude. And let me explain you why. For the first time among Russian Jewry, Nomianism itself, halacha itself, is under principled attack, meaning in principle, which leads to the defenders of Nomianism composing their own principled defense of the Nomian tradition. But what does that mean? The dialogue is going to break down. It's going to be like Trump. In doing so, as soon as you have principled expositions of opposing opinions concerning Nomianism, you have the sharpening of opposing views about the very nature of Judaism and about fundamentalism itself. Once that's on the table for debate, you're certainly going to get many who oppose fundamentalism and Nomianism, but you'll also get the opposite. So what does that mean? You bring a very divisive rhetoric into the Jewish zone, which means you get the beginning of orthodoxy, which is fundamentalism in fighting opposition to non-fundamentalism, which was new to Eastern Europe and new to the Russian Empire. It used to be that everybody's like a little more from, a little less from, a little more, all part of the same community, just occupying different places on the spectrum. And now it's the Orioles versus the Yankees. And each one wants to kill the other. To use Baltimore talk, and this is important, do you write articles defending halacha and fundamentalism in the Jewish Times? Or do you boycott the Jewish Times, start your own newspaper, write your own stuff in the Yeteda Mishpacha? There's a lot in what I just said, because when everything's in the Jewish Times, you're all part of the same Baltimore Jewish community, and just have different points of view. You're going to write in a different tone anyway, and you're simply trying to say, this is how my part of the street sees it, versus your part. If you get divorced, you say, I have nothing to do with the Jewish Times. I create my own little world. And I have my own newspapers. All the rest of it, then what we're really saying is like this. Yes, we all live in Baltimore, Maryland, but I'm totally divorced. You go and live your life the way you do it. I have nothing to do with you. And which has happened? Okay? In the one case, there's dialogue in community. In the other case, there's the opposite of dialogue in community. And this has happened to us today. Because nobody writes anything in the Jewish Times, and everybody's instead reading these alternative media outlets, because that's what they find speaks to them. But it's also a much sharper discourse, and one in which you totally delegitimate the other position. To delegitimate the other position. You see? And is that healthy for a community? Well, the answer is obvious. And so, indeed, this is the journalistic manifestation of a split in the Jewish community. Okay? Because I can guarantee you, 3/4 of Jews have all never heard of Mishpacha. No, you see what I'm saying? And yet, all these families are getting Mishpacha and they're totally uninterested in Jewish times. To be perfectly honest, the Jewish community is post-Jewish times already because the assimilation is going there. But you know what I mean. Well, you get the idea. So, if you start to have Orthodox newspapers, you're creating a ghetto. First in the journalistic manifestation of it, and then you and I today, 200 years later, 150 years later, live in the physical manifestations of it. Because we live in a ghetto. It's called apartheid, Green Spring, whatever, you know. Well, we do. You understand? We never really see the other Jews. You know, I mean, you see them, but, you know, not really. Okay? And everybody's got a cousin. They come to the wedding, but that's it. True or not? You know, you have this, you know, they're related, but that's it. It's very sad, but it's a reality. It reflects something that started in Russia and Eastern Europe in the 1860s. It took a long time for it to play out, but it starts in the reign of Alexander II and this new atmosphere of increased journalism and expression of ideas, but the ideas become radicalized. So there you have it. Until now, this was bad news for the Maskilim. Because, let's put it this way, if you're publishing everything in the Jewish Times, and I'm the editor of the Jewish Times, and I'm not particularly religious, so I kind of, even though I'm presenting a journalistic vehicle that seems to be neutral, it's not exactly neutral. It can't be. It can't be. And you're going to write for me, you're going to tone down and soften your rhetoric to appeal to a wider audience. It's actually not bad from a communal perspective. So until now, the journalistic power had been in the hands of the Maskilim. So before 1860s, the big rabbis even are all writing in Hamagim and Hasfira and all the rest of, you know, the Netziv or Bishal Salanter, all the rest of it. It's all writing whatever they want to say in the Maskilim newspapers because that's what was out there. Who were, after all, the publishers of the newspapers. This profoundly affected the dialogue in a way not friendly to very strong expressions of Frumkeit, because you've got to be a gentleman when you're writing in a communal-wide media forum. There was a plus as well as a minus to this. For one thing, it pushed the Frum to a rationalist and moderate discourse, because, like I said, if you're writing in the Hamag and all the rest of it, you can't come across like some Frum jerk. You see? So it pushes you to a moderate and rationalist discourse. At the same time, it pressured the Maskilim to use a civil term in terms of fundamentalism and nominalism. They had to respect the Jewish tradition as well. One did not explicitly criticize fundamentalism and nominalism. You just criticize fanaticism. Really, you know, I know I'm getting hooked on this. If if anybody's old enough to remember, which nobody here is, you know, the old Jewish times from long ago. I had to do this research when I did Rabbi Rudin business. So you can pull out the old articles of the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all the rest of it. Indeed, it's nothing sharp there. You understand? They never speak against the Jewish tradition, even though a lot of people aren't keeping it. The religious people writing in there are always using a very moderate kind of term. Everybody's chummy, bummy, and you know, it's all nice and nice and good. Not today. Of course, radicals in the religious right and the secular left felt unable to express their true feelings in that kind of press. But with the Lilienblum affair that I just described, which took place in 1868 to 1870, and its aftermath, with the general trend of the 1860s, again, the high watermark of Alexander II's liberalism, to legitimate sharper Maskilic criticism of the Frum, civil discourse in the Jewish media deteriorates. And you start to get, what I talked about a couple years ago, the barbs of the extreme, it's not the right word, but the very strong Maskilim, like Yalagi Udalev Gordon, who has all these poems where he's a brilliant poet who can rip apart all the fundamentals of the nomism and all the halachas. Nobody can do it like him, right? Well, he can describe how a lady's messed over in the get system, and how a husband beat up his wife because he's too strict on the Pesach preparation. It's what's the right word? A poison chocolate. Okay, Udalev Gordon. And what does that mean? You're finding now sharp attacks on the traditional principles of Russian Judaism. So all this led, as it always does, to the evolution of a Haredi self-consciousness, okay, which had already happened in Germany, right? In Central Europe, we already had this because of the rise of the reform movements. You have the Chassam Sober in Hungary and Stanford Raphael Hirsch. This is at the bottom of the Ettlinger, the teacher of Stanford Raphael Hirsch, who, among others, was a famous gadol, but among other things, he started the first Frum newspaper, which you see over in the middle, the Troyens Zionswächter, or as they call it in Hebrew, Shomer Hatzion Aneman. And that's a milestone. What does that mean? No, we don't go into regular press now. The Orthodox have their own thing, and we're deliberately, living in our own separate culture. This newspaper is not for you. It's for this. And I read an article the other day. A historian wrote Hirsch's Chumash came out because of a guy Philipson, who was like a reform rabbi, and he published a very famous translation, very widely used in Germany, the Philipson Chumash, so to speak, written in a reform style. And Hirsch all blew up about this, and he wrote the Hirsch Chumash, and he said like this: "This is not meant for reform home. You guys shouldn't buy it. This is meant for just for the Orthodox." Now you have two separate Chumash. We got this now with the Art Scroll. You understand? Again, to use language that you'll understand. 60 years ago, everybody had the Hertz Chumash. The conservative shul had it, the reform shul had it, the Orthodox shul had it. This one emphasized this part, that one emphasized that part. The Moors had the same Chumash. True, now, a different world, isn't it? Okay? It's a different world. And the Art Scroll takes no prisoners. It's totally from with no, even 0.5% of anything totally not from in it. And they do very well. But they're sectoral. They appeal to one sector. It actually overflows a little bit in the zone conservative shul, but mainly it's meant for a frum crowd, and even I would say a yeshivish crowd, and they're written that way, and they do very well. It drives the elders crazy, because I go sometimes to conferences, professors, and they say, "Why is the Art Scroll? No, I wrote a book, nobody reads it, and they wrote some junk, and everybody's reading it, So, it's publications, media tell you a lot about the state of contemporary culture. And from Russia, you start to see proliferation of distinctly Orthodox organs and things like that, then it's a sign that a Pirud is developing within Eastern European Jewry, although I wouldn't say it ever gets to the lengths that it did in Hungary and Germany the other day. Some people here were on my trip last week. When you go to Budapest, you see 3 gigantic shuls all within a block of each other, and one's the Orthodox shul, and one's the Neolog, the Reform shul, and one's the traditional shul who's trying to say, we don't want to be part of any of this stuff. We just want to be a regular Shabbos, Yontif synagogue of old days, and both sides are against them. Status quo, they call it. A gigantic shul, right? With minarets at the top, no less. But what does that tell you? It's a pirud, you understand? The shattering of the concept of Klal Yisrael. All this, but unlike in Hungary and Germany, there's no mass base for Haredism. There's been no radical reform movement in Russia. So what I just described to you is an elitist phenomenon. I can name you this famous rabbi, this author, or something like that was part of this. The Hamonam out there, it was the 1860s and 70s. They're like I said before. We keep the mitzvahs, we keep this, all the rest of it. We don't have no strong opinions on any political matter whatsoever. And, the Maskilim are a little this way, and these guys are a little that way, and life goes on as it always did. And this small group of people writing these papers are thinking the masses, no, you don't get it. Right? If you keep up with this, you won't survive. We have to figure out some way. They didn't know how in the 1860s and 70s. We have to figure out some way to connect with the masses and then do like Karl Marx says, give them a class consciousness, give them a frum consciousness. So today in Israel, for example, the old-fashioned traditional Jew of yesteryear that once upon a time existed, of a Jew who was a Shomer Shabbos and voted for Ben Gurion. Do you see how people like that? It would be unthinkable. You see? Because the personal political consciousness has become an inseparable part of what a frum Jew is. Not just do you keep Shabbos. And all this you can trace to this crazy range that I'm talking about over here. Consequently, because it is, we're going to see that in the 1860s and 70s and during the pogroms, the big rabbis and types like that speak one way in the press and public and another way behind closed doors. And so famous people like Rabbi Yitzchak Inspector and the Netziv and Yisrael Salanter will talk the political correct talk outside, but behind the closed doors, they talk the Haredi talk. You see? Because they see that Judaism, as it's going in this way, is just going to disintegrate. But the public, if I said it, my Baal Batim would throw me out. They say I'm a fanatic. This was a big term. And so I don't say it. I say it to the few. The undertow of towards secularization, Russianization, towards the new world of European civilization is very powerful in the 1860s, 70s. And the Rabbanim did not know how to deal with it. Not in that period. It's very interesting. These rabbis, they're like a deer in the headlights. Like, what do you do to win the youth over? How do you stop it? And they simply didn't know. They weren't prepared. The most interesting example, as far as I know, is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. I'm sure everybody's heard of, obviously, and was a very thoughtful, intellectual type person, great vision, but also very limited because he just grew up in Lithuania with no secular education. He saw things in it, but yes, he always thinks out of the box. He was an original thinker, and he's going crazy, literally. In the reign of Alexander II, he leaves Russia in 1857, just at the beginning of the reign, and he spends the reign of Alexander II in Germany, next door to Russia. And he's trying to find there the magic bullet, the silver bullet. How do you come up with a kind of, from Judaism, that will appeal to the youth? And, will enable them to withstand the temptations of Russification and all the modernism and all the rest of it. How do you still want to stay there? Because he knew that in Germany you had small groups like this. These two rabbis had small groups of following who were already modern, but were still Shomer Shabbos and all the rest of it, and were committed to Torah. And how do you do it? Not that we're going to do it the exact same way in Russia, because he knew that, but something's there. You know what I'm saying? Something's there. There's a very famous story I told it when we were in Europe. I'm sure I've told it before, but people forget, so thank God for that. And that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, there's no picture of him because he's old school. He wouldn't allow himself to be ever made a picture. And he stayed for a number of years in Berlin. And he went once to the house of Israel Hildesheimer, who had by that time become the Orthodox rabbi of the community in Berlin, what we would call today a neo-Orthodox and modern, the Kohen Derech Eretz type, Rabbi Dr. Israel Hildesheimer. It's 1870s. And he went in to see him, and he walked in the house and got like a culture shock, like a shock, because it was a big dining room, and the living room was all full of girls, teenage girls, and the rabbi's giving a class like in Kiddush Shulchan Aruch, in Halacha, I think it was Hanukkah. Now, he walked out like you hit him over the head with a baseball bat, because this is unheard of in Russia. It doesn't happen. Rabbi doesn't talk to girls. They don't give a class to girls. And they asked him about it. As a very famous answer, he said, listen, Voltezan in Lita, if he was in Lithuania, they'd defrock him. From the Rabbanis. He'd get defrocked. But I hope that I should have the merit to sit next to him in Gan Eden or something like that. So in other words, I see this the way I can't do it. But this is necessary. Of course, it evolved in the Beis Yaakov as we know today. But in the 1870s, change is not easy, you see? And because this is so powerful, so Yisrael Salanter even contemplated desperate measures. And it's very fascinating to me from one of his early biographers, Miyakim Mark, who says, listen to this. This is from a Yiddish biography translated into English by Lucy Davidowitz. She's talking about one of Yisrael Salanter, who, is fun. Said neither his age nor ill health kept him from seeking to reinforce traditional Judaism might better be able to resist modern trends. Seeing how great was the ignorance of Judaism even among the Orthodox, he concluded that preaching on ethics and morals was inadequate when the study of Torah itself was being neglected. He tried to introduce modern methods to study the Talmud for young people no longer able to devote to it 8 or 10 hours a day for many years, as was the style in Lithuania. Okay? He was in Germany. He first sought Orientalists, the professors of Near Eastern Studies, to prepare a dictionary of Aramaic words in the Talmud. He went to Berlin on this mission, but nothing came of it. It then occurred to him to have the Talmud translated into Ivrit and published with a brief and simple commentary. Notice he said, let's do Steinsaltz. Okay? In the 1870s, it was his plan to assign 100 rabbis to the task, each to translate 30 blot, but nothing came of that either. Perhaps the rabbis opposed the ideas of reform, or perhaps people didn't know Hebrew well enough. Then, seeing that young people were giving up the Talmud altogether, he thought of translating it into a modern language. Art Scroll. A notion that aroused considerable protest at the time among the Orthodox. Rabbi Yisrael believed that the Gentile world ought to be acquainted with the enormous cultural riches in the Talmud. Gentile students would more likely sharpen their wits on the Talmud's logic than on Greek and Latin classics. It was his conviction that the younger Jewish generation would have more respect for the Talmud if the Gentiles recognized it as a great cultural monument. They would remain closer to Jewish tradition and then take pride in their people and their religion, but unable to accomplish this, at the age of 70, he left for Paris. Meaning, he was looking for out of the box. I said, try Steinsaltz, try Art Scroll, try translating it in Sassino. Because there's put into German and introduce it. These are radical measures beyond belief. And make college courses for non-Jews in the Talmud, because then Jews will have respect for it. What does that mean? He's clawing, looking for straws. It's an indication. Now listen, anything he did was a shame Shemayim, if you know who he was. So it's an indication of how desperate the situation was, and most people who don't know the history at that time don't realize this, because the 60s and 70s people thought, the wave of the future is the wave of the future. They're going to be post-Judaism, or certainly post-traditional Judaism, or certainly post-Talmudic Judaism. How do we save ourselves in the midst of all this? Now the pogroms will change everything. But until then, Russia looked like it's going on a very specific course. Little by little, these people moved towards the solution that they didn't get to until really late 70s, early 80s, which is a Musar yeshiva. That's coming later. But until then, it didn't happen. So what can I tell you? The atmosphere before the pogroms is not friendly to these ideas. The secular future looks bright. And what is to happen? But really, the Frum need have no fear. Things will shortly change in Russia. Many beautiful dreams will burst like bubbles and be replaced by a nightmarish reality. Right? And pretty soon you'll get that. And then a lot of illusions that people had about a glorious future within Russia and a glorious future within European culture will come shattering. And then there'll be something of a reconsideration. When the reconsideration happens, some will turn to the right to re-engage with Jewish tradition. Others will turn to the radical left, to communism and terrorism, radicalism, and all the rest of it. But the middle class, bourgeois situation I've been trying to describe tonight, which is very powerful, because you and I live in such a culture today. In the 1860s, during most of the reign of this Tsar, was perceived and experienced as being very powerful, and the regime wanted the Jews to go this direction. The regime wanted the Jews to de-Judaize, with the ultimate goal that they had, that once they'll be totally amalgamated into Russia. Events never turn out exactly the way you planned them. So we have the unintended consequences of the liberal reforms, the few liberal reforms of Alexander II. But the most unintended consequence was, of course, the rise of the terrorism, which killed him. That's something, obviously, he did not, plan for. Or maybe I'm wrong. That we'll see next time. Good night. So we'll dive in 2-3 minutes where we always do. I ain't touching it. So what was it, a bad computer or what was it? Okay.